questo è molto importante per me. Lo dico ai miei schierani, miei amici, perché è molto importante? Perché avere qui il professor Steven Vanderputten per me è una gioia in quanto ci lega un'amicizia antica, ma non è questo il motivo per cui Steven Vanderputten è qui perché noi siamo convinti che le sue ricerche ci aiutino, il profilo di grande ricercatore internazionale, ci aiutino a entrare nei meandri delle nostre questioni metodologiche, nello spirito appunto di queste nostre lezioni. Chi è Steven Vanderputten? È professore ordinario di storia dell'alto e pieno medioevo, tradunque all'Università di Ghent, nel Belgio. Studia lo sviluppo delle comunità religiose, in particolare uno studioso del monachesimo come fenomeno sociale, ma non solo di monachesimo. I suoi temi vanno infatti a toccare la memoria e la costruzione delle identità collettive, la gestione dei conflitti, i rituali e i comportamenti pubblici, le pratiche comunicative, le questioni di genere e leadership religiosa, lo sviluppo istituzionale e, non ultimo per importanza, il tema della riforma nel Medioevo, intesa nella sua processualità. Ha pubblicato molte cose. In particolare mi è caro il volume sul Monastic Reform as a Process, cioè la riforma monastica come processo del 2013, riforma, conflitto e identità corporative, immaginare la leadership religiosa nel Medioevo, Dark Ages Nunnery sul monachesimo femminile, alto medievale, Medieval Monasticism, un lavoro di sintesi. Ha co-curato, come risultato di iniziative e progetti internazionali, molte pubblicazioni collettive e dei medievisti di punta delle università del Belgio, dell'Europa, è impegnato al di qua dell'Oceano Atlantico e infatti è stato a Princeton per lunghi periodi e ha avuto prestigiose fellowship a Cambridge, nei Paesi Bassi e non ultimo a Brescia e Milano. Pas dernier pour importance, a Brescia e Milano è uno scambio che facemmo grazie all'Accademia dei Lincei. Ha ricevuto il premio Friedrich Besseler della Fondazione von Humboldt, è stato premiato dall'Accademia Reale Fiamminga con la massima onoreficenza accademica del Belgio e qui ci siamo incontrati, diversi progetti di ricerca finanziati sulla riforma monastica, l'identità religiosa femminile, la pace di Dio, il lungo X secolo. È il vicepresidente dell'Istituto Henri Piéven per gli studi medievali a Ghent e ha dentro moltissimi comitati direttivi, in particolare una mia cara, quella Communitas di Brepols, in cui ci si dedica proprio allo studio delle forme della vita religiosa medievale. È un grande piacere per noi oggi e lo ringraziamo perché è nel bel mezzo del semestre della didattica nella sua università a Ghent. Consideriamo questa sua disponibilità un segno di amicizia verso l'istituto e ormai è reclutato tra i nostri collaboratori fissi e quindi siamo ben contenti e onorati di averlo tra noi. La parola oggi è appunto un tema molto vicino a quello che abbiamo visto oggi nel rapporto tra storia e scienze sociali, dalle istituzioni agli attori sociali, sociologia e studio del Medioevo monastico dal IX al XII secolo. Il titolo è in inglese, la sua relazione sarà in inglese, la discussione potrà essere in inglese ma anche in francese, ovviamente, e lui può capire benissimo l'italiano e risponderci in francese e in inglese senza nessun problema.
Vuol dire anche
Ah, benissimo, mi informa il nostro direttore che quello che io non avevo capito cosa servisse serve per avere il testo in inglese scritto per seguire meglio il lavoro. Allora, molto volentieri gli do la parola e lo ringrazio.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais commencer avec quelques mots en français. C'est toujours difficile pour moi de décider dans quelle langue je vais parler quand je vais en Italie parce que malheureusement, je ne parle pas l'italien. Je le comprends assez bien, mais bon, enfin, j'ai un collègue ici pour m'aider quand il y a des questions qui m'échappent. Mais donc, souvent, j'ai l'expérience, quand je parle en français, il y a une moitié les vieux qui me comprennent et les jeunes ne me comprennent pas du tout. Et donc, vice-versa. Donc, maintenant, parce que c'est une école doctorale, because this is a doctoral school, I will be speaking in English. Yeah. Et donc, pour ceux qui ont du mal à comprendre l'anglais, il y a un code QR que j'ai fait ce matin. Mes étudiants vont dire que c'est très malin. Et donc j'espère que ça marche. Ça donne un lien vers un document, un fichier en Dropbox avec le texte en main. Et donc si vous êtes malin aussi, vous pouvez immédiatement, simultanément traduire le texte en italien si vous voulez. C'est un texte avec beaucoup de cookies, beaucoup d'erreurs, mais bon, j'avais l'idée de partager ça avec vous si vous avez des difficultés à me suivre. Donc c'est un lien Dropbox, il vous faudra peut-être télécharger l'app de Dropbox, mais bon, enfin, ça marche pour vous? Oui. Ah, c'est très bien. Donc, merci. Merci Shanico pour cette introduction, and now I will continue in English. And thank you to the organizers of this doctoral school for inviting me to Rome to give this presentation on the relationship between sociology and medieval historical research. When I was first asked to speak about the impact of sociology on the field, I think it was in last August and then again in September because I didn't answer quickly enough. I decided to focus on the study of the early and high medieval monasticism for three reasons. And the first reason is that I'm someone who specializes in the study of early and high medieval monasticism, so I can say at least a few things that are meaningful about that. But the second one is the study of monastic life between the 9th and 12th centuries had been profoundly shaped by sociological models. So going back at the beginning of the 20th century, we have sociologists and historians commenting specifically on high and early medieval monasticism from a sociological perspective and trying to apply macro and micro sociological models onto medieval monasticism. And then a final reason is that recent debate on the relevance of these models within the field of medieval monastic studies are important enough to discuss with you, even if you are not a specialist of monasticism. Why is this? Because they have been tested quite extensively and also criticized quite extensively, these models. And I think the implications of this discussion are way beyond this particular field I work in. So that's the reason I'm going to talk about these things, and although I will use examples from monasticism, and I will refer to discussions within monasticism, I hope that you will see, and if you please tell me, that a number of these discussions actually have much more impact beyond this specific field. Alright, so a very general remark. As you all know, the fields of sociology and history share a long and entwined past dating back to the 19th and early 20th centuries. The sociologist Max Weber used historical methods to develop typology, authority, and religion, while someone like Emil Durkheim did the same to study law and ritual, and I could mention many, many other names, of course. But for their part, historians, for instance those of the already mentioned Annales school in France, explicitly drew on sociology to move away from what they termed event history, histoire événementielle, and come to something which they called total history, histoire totale, which then would include the study of structures, collectivities, and patterns that emerged from the actions and mentalities of these collectivities, and which are often hard to recognize if you look at the medieval sources themselves. It's often hard to see patterns and structures without any kind of guidance from sociology, anthropology, and other kinds of social or concepts and models from other social sciences. And I always like to show Marc Bloch because I much admire him, one of the leading scholars from the Annales school famously suggested that history is essentially a branch of sociology, and maybe he also wanted to suggest that sociology is essentially a branch of history, that the two things are actually part of one and the same, should be part of one and the same reflection on human action and human collectivity. I give you the French quote from his Apologie pour l'histoire au métier d'historien from 1949, which is still very much recommended if you are a young scholar and you want to read something very deeply inspiring, then read Marc Bloch's work. And Marc Bloch's biography is deeply inspiring, but I'm not going to go into that. But anyway, in translation, there is only one science of humankind in time, which constantly needs to combine study of the dead with that of the living. What should we call it? I have already explained why the ancient name of history, historia, seems to be the most comprehensive, the least exclusive. Now, monastic institutions have always held a particular fascination for sociologists and historians who sought to explore the intersection between the two disciplines. Their motivation to approach this phenomenon from a sociological or a macro-sociological, whatever you want to call it, perspective originates from three large factors. One is very obvious, is the scale and visibility of monastic institutions. Monasteries were amongst the largest, most durable, most efficiently organized, and perhaps most importantly of all, the best documented institutions of the medieval period, at least until we reach the end of the Middle Ages, of course. But if you look at the long term for the entire Middle Ages, these are simply the best documented institutions. And this makes them seem especially suitable to trace, identify, and analyze patterns and trends in social organization and conduct. And every time I talk to my fellow sociologists, and I talk about the fact that historical sources are available for some of these institutions for a period of thousands or more, they always get really excited and think, of course, that they have they can work in the same conditions as they would work with an institution nowadays, a company or a factory or a monastery today. And of course, then I have to explain to them that lots of sources are missing, lots of sources are very subjective, and of course we cannot interview the participants. I once had to explain this to a fellow sociologist, that we unfortunately cannot interview dead monks. The second reason is the apparent, which, because I'm going to return to this, regularity of monasticism. Rules such as the Regula Benedicti and many, many other rules, other normative texts, customaries, consuetudines, statutes, and so on, they create the impression that monasticism was actually a complex of standardized systems, so that you have forms of monasticism in the West, and that these are all strictly organized according to a specific rule. And so from a distance, monasticism can appear to be laboratories of social discipline and cultural production. And these written texts, these written rules and norms are being implemented. It's as if you can watch monks trying to realize life as it's described in these written rules. And I will return to that because I don't think so. And this, in principle, made them and still makes them appealing subjects for comparative and structural analysis. A third reason is the influence on secular society. Macro-sociological approaches let sociologists and historians connect monastic discipline and ascetic ideals to broader processes of social differentiation and domination. In the optic of these scholars, monasticism both reflected and shaped class and status structures, and as such functioned in medieval society as a system and a model of social differentiation. And for instance, monasteries offered elites a way of a means of symbolic capital and spiritual prestige acquired through donations, prestigious burials, and so on, which allowed them to differentiate themselves from other groups in society. It's as simple as that. So rather than taking monasteries as an isolated religious phenomenon, 20th century scholars used macro-sociological frameworks to approach the way monasteries shaped, mirrored, and mediated broader social processes. And they conceptualized monasticism as a formative institution in the development of European social order, which allowed them to analyze the ways in which monastic structures produced enduring economic, social, and cultural patterns. There are many important contributors to this trend, and I have to start with Max Weber. You cannot but start with Max Weber. Anyone in my field talks about Max Weber, also we need to talk about him, and his legacy is indeed very important. He conceptualized medieval monasticism as a laboratory for the rationalization of Western society and culture. So he sees, it's very evolutionist, he sees a progress in rationality in Western society, which begins actually with the emergence of an organized monastic life. He argues that monastic life represented a routinized and disciplined form of life that emerged from a state of charismatic origins, and that fostered broader patterns of economic and social rationality. So monasticism established a rational way of organizing a collective, grounded in written rules, and for him that was the basis for a number of experiments, and over time these experiments spilled into the rest of society, which then adopted elements of monastic organization. In his view, the monastery functioned as what he calls a rational life order, where time, labor, and behavior were strictly regulated according to spiritual principles which were anchored in written rules. And this, in his opinion, especially the early and high Middle Ages, represented a deep contrast with the rest of society. The rest of society, which according to him was very disorganized, very irrational, which of course is not true, but and in his opinion that helped reshape this society. Weber's ideas profoundly shaped those of the German historian Gerd Melville, and now I jump into the future, and we're talking about the 1980s to the present. Gerd Melville and his School of Medieval Studies, which is centered on the Forschungsstelle für vergleichende Ordensgeschichte at the Universität of Dresden, who draw on such concepts taken from Weber, but also Niklas Luhmann. Melville examines how the monastic orders of the 12th century and later Middle Ages, developed rules, norms, and organizational forms to stabilize across time. His approach highlights the role of monastic community, the role of monasticism in the emergence of what he calls institutional rationality, which is based on texts, rules, written rules, and which is also self-replicating. So you don't actually need individual people to allow monasticism to continue to exist. It can actually replicate itself as if it was a sort of artificial intelligence machine. It forces its members to replicate the system. At the heart of Melville's argument is a classic Wibben framework, which says that all monastic orders go through a process of routinization, which takes them from a highly unstable, charismatic origins beginning by established by a founding figure like Francis of Assisi, Dominic, St. Dominic, or any other figure you can imagine, St. Benedict, Pier Damiani, whoever. Takes them from those unstable beginnings, charismatic beginnings, to a stable, bureaucratized form, which allows it to exist across time and after the death of the, not as a decline or loss, so it doesn't see it as a loss of charisma, but as a transformation process which is necessary to explain the survival and the adaptability of a medieval movement, monastic movement. And he had from the beginning in the late 11th century, a sort of a feedback loop was initiated in which processes of routinization in different monastic orders inevitably led to innovation. So you have one monastic order that originates through the axiomatic founder, then it routinizes, then you have another movement emerging that takes elements from that previous movement, and you get a sort of a feedback loop from one movement into the next. And each time new elements are being added. So you get of procedures, but also innovation in procedures. Melville also relies on Niklas Luhmann's ideas to argue that monastic institutions were structured by recurring forms, logics, and patterns. Essentially always the same thing, but in slightly different and more sophisticated form. And he describes those in quasi-linguistic terms. He talks about a grammatica institutionum, a grammar of institutions. It's something like human language, which is embedded in our subconscious, in our neurosystem or something. And so in monasticism, there is something which goes beyond the action and individual people, leaders, and is actually recurring time and again. To an extent, Melville's work also builds on that of Giles Constable, my good friend, who unfortunately left us 5 years ago, who in his book, The Reformed 12th Century, relies implicitly on Weberian ideas to explain why the 11th and 12th centuries saw waves of reform, waves of innovation, waves of routinization of charisma and the rising orders, and to argue that this process was actually a motor of innovation and institutional rationalization within monasticism and outside of monasticism. So you see other groups in society adopting elements of that rationalization. There were other scholars still who sought to understand medieval monasticism but looked beyond the question of spiritual reform and institutional rationalization. They were interested more in processes of community building action, so how to identify yourself and to distinguish yourself from other groups. In the 1990s, Ilana Friedrich Silber sought to bring together insights from Weberian sociology with gift exchange theory, about which we've heard already today, as originally formulated by Marcel Mauss. Silber argued that religion is best understood through the logic of the gift. It involves receiving, giving, and giving back spiritual power, and thereby creating enduring social and moral bonds. And here you hear for the first time that the boundaries between sociology and anthropology may not be as strict as we sometimes might expect. Her work transforms Weber's analysis of charisma and Mauss's theory of gift-giving into a unified framework for understanding how religion organizes meaning, obligation, and social life. And another important name I would like to mention is that of Lutz Kelber, who treated monastic communities as educational and organizational systems, which he calls schools, which should not be understood as schools in the narrow sense of the word. It's not a teacher with his disciples, but rather environments in which people are learned discipline, communal living, and institutional roles where, in other words, ascetic ideals systematically taught but also reproduced. Kelber explicitly says in his book, schools at some point acquire an autonomous agency, which means that you don't actually need someone to decide that people should be socialized in that environment. Because it exists, it actually socializes people. So it's an institution that develops its own agency. I'm very skeptical. But in the early 2000s, Wojtek Szczesierski drew on the work of Erwin Goffman, Michel Foucault, and Pierre Bourdieu to argue that medieval monasteries manifested many characteristics of a total institution. And Erwin Goffman, of course, is the man behind this idea of total institutions. And he says that enclosure, routine, central authority, surveillance, and attempts at forming the members' perception of themselves and the surrounding world are all features that are actually typically fit the idea of a total institution. An enclosed world which is completely focused on itself and which replicates itself almost automatically. Always this recurring idea of institutions at the heart of these theories. Szczesierski conceptualizes the rule of Saint Benedict and derived text not just as normative documents, but as instruments of socialization, which shaped embodied dispositions and collective identities. And so the monastic enclosure, the monastery, then functioned as a way of controlling people, disciplining them, without, again, much more human agency. You have the rule, someone has to impose the rule tells people how to behave, and then it feeds itself. It's like a sort of a machine that continuously keeps itself in motion. And then, very briefly, Brian Patrick Maguire argued that monasteries were not only institutional structures, but also communities formed by ties of friendship and brotherhood, where he blends sociology with cultural history. But what is interesting about Maguire is that he occasionally indicates that you don't actually need the intervention of a system in which friendship is fostered in a specific way so that it replicates itself. Again, I have difficulties imagining how that works, but these are very influential ideas going into the early 21st century. Yet more sociological perspectives conceptualize monasticism's institutionalization as a force that shaped secular society. The great French historian Georges Duby, in his famous book on the Three Orders, argued that monks' radical self-portrayal as oratores and their institutional structures helped stabilize an imagined medieval order, but still one that gave a shape to the way in which people behaved and interacted with each other. In the early 1980s, Constance Bouchard employed an elite and institutional sociological model focused on kinship and networks. Her monograph, which you can see on the top right, Sword, Mitre and Cloister, detailed how monastic institutions stabilized medieval society because of their roles as what she calls nodes. If you're familiar with network theory, nodes and edges, and she sees monasteries as at the heart of networks. She sees them as converging points of networks. And so noble lineage, politics, church authority all converged in these nodes. Barbara Rosenwein applied Marcel Mauss's theory of gift-giving to interpret monasteries as hubs of reciprocal social exchange. So it's not exactly the same idea, but something very similar. You have centers of power, so to speak, in which different influences converge. And so these give shape to social networks that were centers on these monasteries, but whose influence went far beyond that. Also Stephen White, he relied on gift-giving theory to postulate that the laudatio parentum, so the consent rituals for donations, if someone gives someone to a monastic institution, you often have separate documents in which family members then agree with the donation and get compensation for that. These show kinship, solidarity, and negotiated obligations. So he says these rituals and these transactions actually function as a way of keeping society together and structuring society. Later still, Dominique Jonia-Prat applied sociological models of boundary making and exclusion on Cluniac reform, framing it as constructing social order through the symbolic exclusion of others. Je pense que le livre de Jonia-Prat a été traduit en italien. No? No? No. Well, it's available in English and in French, the book by Jonia-Prat. Peut-être en italien, je ne sais pas. No, pas. All of these studies identified macro-sociological patterns in medieval society and culture, as well as their underlying causes, and they're very useful and they're very attractive. Very attractive because we, of course, are confronted with an enormous amount of primary sources which don't tell us about patterns, which just tell us about a donation, which just tell us about a laudatio parentum, which just tell us that someone issued a new rule at some point. How to make sense of those rules, how to make sense of those documents and transactions, for that we often look at models coming from other social sciences. And so what I call messy sources, we can organize them with the aid of these models. But the problem, of course, is that patterns we recognize if we study the primary evidence up close are seldom as predictable or linear as these sociological models suggest. The underlying causes of these patterns are rarely clear, and their causal relationship to subsequent developments is often extremely difficult to demonstrate. Indeed, as early as the 1980s, many medieval historians became skeptical of rigid sociological models and grand theories, be they Marxist, Weberian, or structuralist, that seem to flatten contingency and difference, that do not seem to take into account things that happen just simply. Think in terms of patterns and models and trends, but they don't take into account, or don't much take into account, human agency, accidents of history. And we as historians are trained to look at those. And so these models we find so attractive. They are attractive, but at the same time they don't really always work if you try to fit them in our sources or with our sources. In an overlooked article which was published in this volume, which is highly recommended if you read German, and there's also something like DeepL and ChatGPT these days to translate text, Barbara Rosenwein noted that there were problems with Max Weber's celebrated idea that 10th and 11th century monastic reform, in particular Cluniac reform, was an organized effort to establish a specific social order. And up until that point, the dominant idea was that there was something like Cluniac reform. The order of Cluny, and well, not the order of Cluny, but the Abbey of Cluny had launched a program for reforming all of society and had been highly successful. Rosenwein argued that if you look at these sources, the messy sources, you could see that many of the abbots of Cluny, the first 5 abbots of Cluny, they just went along with whatever was happening and whatever opportunities presented themselves. They did not roll out a grand program for societal reform. And you see every successive abbot of Cluny having lots of successes, at least up until Hugh, and then Pontius is a different story in the early 12th century, but it's not like they're implementing a big reform to reform all of Western society. That's just not there in the sources. So she said, Weber, useful, interesting, inspiring, but at the same time doesn't really fit what we're seeing in the evidence. What we're seeing in the evidence is people organizing themselves, people trying to influence their own destiny, and that other people at the same time having to respond to things they didn't really expect, like we have to today, like I have to do in my personal life, and like I'm sure all of you have to do, and like entire societies have to do. Another critique that some sociologists had exaggerated the emphasis on institutions and systems, and by now you will have understood that I'm also very skeptical about that. And the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who we saw influenced to get Melville's idea, had built an almost post-human cybernetic sociology, which describes society as a vast organizing network of communications, sort of internet of communications, a network of communications that observes, differentiates, and reproduces itself in endless ways, leaving very little space for human agency. And in recent months, I've read Niklas Luhmann quite extensively, and it's very attractive. It's very appealing, especially now in the internet age and artificial intelligence. You kind of say, wow, this is a great idea. But humans really do much in it, and that's problematic. His sociological model of network theory and communication influenced research into monastic networks, in which the Cluniac and monastic orders were studied as trans-regional systems of communication, control, and identity. Read now scholarship on monasticism in the High Middle Ages and the Early Middle Ages. I often read about Cluny did this, Cluny did that, the Cistercian movement did this or that. Yeah, institutions don't do anything unless someone makes them do something. Yeah, so that's problematic. Luhmann's idea also formed ways in which scholars analyze the ways in which norms, written norms, texts and practices circulated, rules circulated, producing what some call monastics public sphere, the Benedictine movement, the Cistercian movement, the Benedictine observance, the Cistercian observance, as if people don't really play a role in this except to make it easy to transmit these rules. This approach highlighted monasticism's role in the emergence of institutional rationality, which was rule-based, written, self-replicating, that things are not machines, that things governed by people. And human agency largely had faded out of the picture, because that was histoire événementielle, it's just people doing little things, but maybe the people are doing bigger things, but it's just complex to describe what the implications are on the short and longer term. And then the final critique was that sociology was becoming increasingly quantitative and presentist, and that was a difficult fit with especially the study of the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. We just don't have the quantitative evidence to analyze them in just the same way that sociologists were doing. And historians, by the way, were drifting towards narrative and interpretation more than cataloguing numbers. The response to these criticisms was in 3 parts, and you have various cultural and linguistic turns in historical research: cultural, linguistic, spatial, post-colonial, material, global, environmental, affective, so emotional, and then you can probably name 15 or 20 more terms, I don't really know. And in some quarters they are seen as a reaction against these rigid sociological models that try to see patterns and institutions doing things and rationality emerging in society. And of course, we now feel uneasy about these models, and so these turns bring to the fore meaning, narrative, agency, emotions also, even if, like the previous speaker, I'm rather skeptical about emotional communities doing anything in particular. The second response was consisted of attempts to reconcile these macro-sociological models, these big models, and their top-down perspective, like Clooney did this, this monasticism did that, with an approach that is informed by what the sources tell us, what the sources tell us about what people do, a human agency. And this allows them to study the members of monastic institutions not just as passive participants in macro-sociological processes and patterns, but as active agents who intervened in a meaningful way in which institutions, communities, and society as a whole evolved. And then the third development, which is quite important, I think, is that sociology itself began to evolve, especially from the late 20th century onwards. Sociology itself dropped some of its rigidity, and under the influence, among others, of social anthropology, began to transform itself. And so, as a result of that, sociologically inspired historical research has moved away abstract macro-sociological modeling for reading human society culture towards a more phenomenological, practice-oriented, and in certain sense also effective understanding of human relations and human conditions. So from this point onwards, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to talk about sociology, but also lots of other influences on historical research, because it's just impossible for the last 25 years to say, let's look at what sociology is doing for historical research, but because it's no longer classic sociology. It's just as simple, because sociology itself has changed to the point that I often talk to sociologists and I say, what you're doing is basically social anthropology. They say, no. They want to protect their department and their positions and their curriculum and that kind of thing. And then, of course, if I talk to philosophers, I sometimes say, well, this is actually some form of philosophical sociology you're doing. They say, no. So everyone is saying, we're not doing that, but at the same time, they're looking over each other's shoulders from their own background, their own historiography, their own methodology, but it's all becoming blended more and more. Even as some of the scholars I mentioned earlier in my presentation were thus developing their own rather rigid ideas, macro-sociological medieval monasticisms, other historians were producing work in which they insist on three things: the role of monastic institutions and their members as social actors, not as entities, just like that. Secondly, the negotiated nature of status, capital, social roles and identities, by which I mean that social roles, status, capital, identities are not fixed but evolve and are the process of a dialectic between different groups in society. And finally, the fact that social identities, roles, relations are a part of a continuously, constantly evolving and therefore also lived experience. Human status doesn't mean anything unless you can actually display it, unless it's recognized by someone else. Otherwise, it's non-existent as far as I'm concerned. It's like the analogy I use for my students is that a king can be a king legally, but if no one recognizes that person as a king, functionally, that person is not a king. It's the same with monks, actually. If no one recognizes them as playing a role in society that is meaningful, then no one cares about them. And apparently they did, because otherwise we wouldn't have all these monasteries. So in what follows, I'm not going to present you a full overview of research trends from the last 20 years, because that would take us far too wide in all kinds of historiographical discussions, and also because I want to kind of keep a connection to sociology, classic sociology, and I think I would venture into philosophy and anthropology and anything really, because sociology itself is evolving. All right, I want to focus on 6 sociological focal points, and that's what I'm going to talk about. The obvious thing to talk about would be charisma, because Max Weber and his theory of charisma, routinization. I will talk about that, but I'm not going to make that the center of the discussion, because it has somewhat faded out of current historical debates, and it's not really all that useful, especially for doctoral students to think much about charisma. There's also books published on this from the last 10 years, so I will mention a couple. And afterwards you can ask questions and I can give you references. Instead, I'm going to talk about rules, written rules, how we look at written rules today for institutions. I'm going to talk about practices of learning, and then I'm going to bring in educational theory and show you how it enriches sociology. I'm going to talk about distinction, which, if you're familiar with sociology, will bring us to Pierre Bourdieu. I'm going to talk about reform. I'm going to talk about social network analysis, and then finally I'm going to talk about networks of things, not of people, but of things. One of the most important conceptual and methodological shifts from the last few decades derives from scholars' skepticism of written rules, the Regula Benedicti, but other monastic rules, and other normative documents, consuetudines, statutes, and a whole bunch of other texts that have a normative meaning and have been recognized as such from the later Middle Ages onwards. For a long time, these were taken as objective accounts of how monastic life was organized. A rule that has a normative value, it's especially from the 12th century onwards, it has a status of law, late 12th century, early 13th century onwards, but before that, it actually also is some kind of law. It professes to be Benedictine. If you say as a community you're Benedictine, you're supposed to follow the text of the rule of Saint Benedict. And for much of the 19th and 20th century, scholars have treated rules and other texts as direct evidence of how monks actually lived. Monastic history was often reconstructed as a kind of legal history about the transmission of rules, their diffusion and their application. So if you wanted to study Benedictine monasticism, the first thing you did was to go and look at the rule of Saint Benedict, which is still a good idea, by the way, but not your end point to me. Recent scholarship, which was influenced by sociology, but also by anthropology and textual criticism, has stressed that rules, customaries, and similar texts cannot be taken as descriptive accounts of monastic life at all. And in hindsight, after we made these suggestions, it seems very obvious. Imagine that we would take our current laws and in 1,000 years' time we would study them, and this is how Italian society is organized. This is how European society is organized. I don't know. You have to look at reality also. There are 5 reasons for this skepticism of rules. First is called the normative gap. Rules talk about ideas to correct problems that are perceived as people think there is a problem and they propose a solution to it. So they often what is not happening or what someone would like to see happening, not necessarily what is happening. It's very obvious. So they reveal debates, anxieties, ideas which are circulating within a certain environment. Strategies. Rules and customaries also serve to persuade, legitimate, and assert authority rather than to record practice. Claiming for a community to claim that they followed the rule of Saint Benedict, a way of situating themselves within the ecclesiastical landscape and with regard to other authorities, does not necessarily mean that they followed the rule of Saint Benedict to the letter. And that's not a subjective judgment. It's not a moral judgment. It's not to say they're bad. It's just to say that saying that you're one thing is another thing than actually doing it. And we see this, for instance, with early medieval monasteries. In texts, you often see reference in charters, for instance, or royal diplomas. This community follows the rule of Saint Benedict. What archaeological evidence, textual evidence sometimes suggests that they're following hundreds, multiple different rules, which they bring together and make something out of. Adherence to a rule, so saying that you follow, is often more important symbolically than in practice. Then you have the multiplicity of rules, and this is something which I already mentioned. What we're often seeing is that communities mix rules together, mix texts together to make out of it. And this is especially relevant for female monastic communities. They do it all the time. In the early and high Middle Ages, they do it all the time. And I forgot to include it in my presentation, there's this famous manuscript from Regensburg from the late 10th century, in which you have the rule of Saint Benedict with all the phrases omitted that the nuns really didn't like, and they inserted and replaced them with parts of the rule of Caesarius of Ars, which is very nice. It gives them lots of freedom, apparently. So it's very selective, it's very odd. But it happens all the time. The more you look into manuscripts of the rule of Regula Benedicti, for instance, from female communities, the more you find passages that really shouldn't be there. But that's just how they did it. And further into the past, 6th centuries, 7th centuries, and even 5th centuries, Albrecht Dien, which if people are interested in monasticism, has written about that, the norm is actually mixed rules. Rules where things are brought together. A rule is something to study and then make something out of for yourself, not something to follow to the letter. And this complicates the idea of one stable rule of life, because it's really hard to use these sources to then study what they're actually doing. Isabelle Cochelin and myself have pointed out, if we look at the period before 1100 also, even consuetudines did not function as law books, did not function as documents which were imposed on other people, but rather as sources to inspire other people or document certain practices. Another aspect or criticism, or reason for skepticism is about historical layering. Rules were adapted, evolved over time. You see this with statutes. For those who work on the later Middle Ages, statutes evolve all the time. It's not like every single sentence of these statutes remains valid for a longer period of time. And this is negotiation, interpretation, discarding also of certain rules. And then finally, a wealth of case studies have revealed to us that even in settings where the members actually insisted on following a specific rule, real-life conditions often significantly deviated from the written text. So if you take the Regula Benedicti and then you look at charters and accounts and whatnot, then you often see a sort of a disjunct between the two. This skepticism, or the skepticism that followed from these observations, has encouraged historians to move away from essentialist portrayals of the Benedictine life and the Cistercian observance. It's really interesting as an idea, but it's more problematic. Instead, they now view monasteries as social environments. Texts, memory and practice were constantly negotiated. And by negotiated, I don't mean a diplomatic negotiation between people, but adapted, modeled to current needs and circumstances. Monks and women religious behavior was shaped by embodied dispositions, learned behaviors, and ingrained ways of acting that originated with their social and cultural environment. Now I'm going to show you, or I am showing you, a book which is really important and should be read by more people than is now read, about late antique Egyptian monasticism, but it offers a really interesting conceptual framework to study how monastic practice originated within a monastic environment. So even if it's about Egypt, even if it's about late antiquity, it's really interesting because she uses Bourdieu's concept of habitus and also the social space and also a phenomenology of landscape archaeology to say that monastic life is a sort of, or the monastery is a field of social practices where symbolic capital is constantly exchanged. You don't have the rule which people follow, it's actually a constant way of interacting, or a constant zone, field in which people are interacting with each other, and through which the monastic habitus is formed, through which customs and practices are actually formed, adapted, discarded, and new ones are introduced, and so on and so on. Through these practices, habitus is both expressed and reproduced. And this perspective shifts the focus from idealized monasticism in text, in rules, to the lived experience of monks and women religious. So it relies on this concept of habitus to explain why the members' practices were coherent and consistent even when written rules were strictly applied. When I started off doing things with medieval monastic history, I sometimes presented at conferences and I talked about communities that professed to be Benedictine, for instance, but did not really always follow. They had prebends, or they did something which was not allowed according to the rule. And then there was always someone in the audience that would say, oh, they were lax, they were not following the rule, they were doing badly, and this is a sign of decline. Maybe it's a social context, maybe it's the environment, maybe it's local tradition that shaped the way in which people acted, and we're not allowed a priori to use the rule to judge the behavior of people as good or bad or in decline, or it's just based on that. You have to take into account a much more complex set of factors. Here I want to briefly interrupt and say, well, this is maybe also a way of rereading, which people are doing, but reread other texts, secular law texts, and how they are followed in secular society. If we aren't following the law, are they doing badly? Are they criminals? Or is it just because society itself asks for adaptation, asks for I would say this. Descriptive accounts of, and here you see other important publications I find important on this particular subject, and which highlight the fact that the habitus and also relations with the outside world, the organization of space, the definitions and understandings of gender, definitions and practices of liturgical activity, and so on and so on. These things are shaped not just by, but by a habitus which is constantly negotiated. I read a book edited by Regine Jean, actually. Johanna Jebe published a really fascinating chapter on St. Gallen, and identities were negotiated at Sangal, but I forgot to include it. And it's not very appealing as an image itself because it's just the first page of the chapter. None of these things actually demolish sociological models people used to rely on. It just gives us a way of nuancing those models and also nuancing the role of rules within our analytical grid. So we can still use rules to interpret medieval attitudes and medieval realities, but we have to adopt maybe a much more nuanced way of looking at them. A closely related question is that of lived practices in monastic settings is that of how the members were so educated. So we can talk about habitus as something which changes all the time, but you have to, talk to people about how to do it, how to acquire this habitus. Until recently, this topic was almost exclusively studied through and quasi-normative texts about formal instruction. So you would read texts written for novices, for instance, or schoolmasters, that kind of thing. However, there is abundant evidence in descriptive accounts from early and high medieval monastic setting that education was a highly interactive process, and also an activity that was about people interacting. Not so much about imposing a curriculum, but about people interacting and talking about what was in the curriculum. The context of education was therefore absolutely key. An opportunity to study these testimonies emerged when the anthropologist Jane Leave and the computer scientist Etienne Wenger in the 1990s proposed the notion of situated learning. And this is just a very complicated way of saying that learning is essentially a social process. Knowledge is created, obtained, and transmitted through shared practices, not through books necessarily, not the institution, but through doing things with them, doing things with these books, engaging with people, sitting together with other people, talking to people. They also propose that not just the people who are the disciples, the pupils learn things, but also the people who teach them things, learn new things. Habitus is, in other words, something that evolves constantly and involves people who are in the habitus, but actually change their own habitus through interaction with people who are inexperienced, which is a really interesting concept. So the habitus within a monastic setting constantly evolves depending on who is in that setting. Leif's ideas have been influential not only in education study, but also in sociology, anthropology, and also in history. They help us conceptualize monasteries as workshops of educational practice. And I'll quickly go over that, and they say formation is a form of participation. If you learn something, if you're educated in a monastic context, you actually participate in a process in which everyone learns, including the teacher, him or herself, which is a really interesting notion, actually. Teaching changes you, and from my own experience, it changes me also the way I think about things. The way, if I teach to students, I think differently about things because I learn to think, anticipate on how they will respond, and to an extent that also changes my habitus, my way of reasoning, maybe a bit more structured and logic, I hope. A second argument is knowledge transmission beyond texts. Monastic life heavily relied on embodied knowledge, and we admire monastic communities because they produce so many texts, but in reality they produce many texts but also performed many things. And the liturgy, the way of interacting, we are fortunate to have texts about that, but in first order they are done. If you look at consuetudines from the 10th century onwards, they talk about things that are done and then someone decides to record them. And we are amazed at the level of detail that's in these consuetudines. How did they do it without having a text? Why is the practice there first and then the text? So this is quite important, because people are embodying the knowledge. A third aspect is about identity formation. Being a monastic individual was less about internalizing doctrines in isolation, so you wouldn't isolate yourself in a cell, with some exceptions, and you know about these exceptions. But it's more about being recognized by others as being monk through shared practices. It's about doing things together. It's about bringing people together and doing the liturgy together. You become a monk because you do the liturgy with others together, with some exceptions, of course. But in Benedict, that's how you are. Again, some exceptions. It's a way of distinguishing yourself also from other groups in society. doing these things together is a way of saying we're not what you are, we're not what people in the outside world is doing. Which, if you look back on it, seems really obvious, but it's an important observation, I think. Learning, in other words, included relational and affective dimensions, and not merely instruction, top-down instruction. And finally, something about networks of practice. Monasteries, of course, were not isolated. They corresponded, they exchanged books, they sent novices and masters to other places. Abbots were exchanged between places, we know this very well. And from an angle of Leef and Wenger, this could be seen as intersecting communities of practice. So you have the monastery as a community of practice, and then they intersect, they cross their lines with other communities of practice, where they circulate knowledge. And this is interesting to reinterpret the old view of, for instance, Cluniac reform, where they say Cluniac reform spreads knowledge. It's people within these networks that spread knowledge, which again seems really obvious, but yeah. So are we going to focus on the network which sends people, or are we going to focus on the people who activate networks and do things with them, circulate ideas? Yeah? I think that it's important to realize, in my opinion at least, it's important to realize that the transmission of knowledge, ideas, know-how of any kind happens through the agency of people. So it's very well to be in a powerful institution, but if you don't do anything, you're not going to transmit any knowledge or know-how to other groups. Beyond descriptive accounts of learning, we also have abundant traces in the written evidence about how learning in monastic settings could take place in a collaborative setting. So we're talking about, people engaging with each other in a learning environment, and it's not easy to conceptualize how that would work. You're sitting around a table and then you're talking to each other. How do we conceptualize that? Just one example among many, but one I'm very fond of, and I would like to edit this document quite soon if I can. This is a document from which I'm going to briefly discuss with you. It's the Roll of Maubeuge. It's a document of 2 meters 30 long. It's from the early 11th century. It originates from a female monastery, which is now in the north of France, not that far from Lille in any case. If you want to see them, so it's a long document. Very odd, no one has studied this properly. It consists of a recto side and a verso side, and on the recto side to the left, sorry that the description is in French, you have the life of the patron saint of Maubeuge, and then you have her testament, which is an apocryphal document from the 9th century. You have a polyptych, so a description of the estates of the monastery, and then it continues on the other side. And from that point onwards, all of a sudden, at number 6 in the second line, you suddenly get individual parts of sentences taken from an enormous amount, because this is just a condensed description, an enormous amount of legal texts, liturgical texts, theological texts, even inscriptions on crucifixes, taken seemingly at random. So these are, if you read them individually, it's just little bits. It's like you turn on the radio and turn it off again. Very, very strange. But if you read all of the fragments in one succession, it suddenly says something about abbatial authority and female agency in the secular world. It's really interesting. So someone created a sort of a DJ mix of texts, really strange. And what is even stranger is that every single extract from a source text is written in a different hand. So what we have is an incoherent collection of extracts, and you can see a fragment of that, but it's really hard. You have to study the document itself. But it's apparently what I suspect, the extracts of the contents of the library of the women of Maubeuge, which they studied together, of which they took extracts and elements, brought them together and made a coherent new text, which is really interesting, and then had each participant in the discussion, and this is hypothetical of course, each participant in the discussion write one sentence. So make the coherence by doing it together. Okay, I can talk more about this, but yeah, that would be for the concept of habitus and situated learning bring us to another of Bourdieu's concepts, which is that of distinction, and which helps us to better understand identity building processes in and beyond monastic settings. In La Distinction, Pierre Bourdieu argued that social groups reproduce their identities and hierarchies through practices of distinction, ways of dressing, ways of eating, ways of speaking, ways of behaving, interacting with other people. And all of those practices signal cultural capital and social position. And the function of the practices which become embedded in the members' habitus is to separate inside from outsiders, to claim authority and to make social hierarchies appear legitimate. Monastic groups certainly cultivated distinction in the early and high Middle Ages, and their authority to an extent rested on being visibly different from the laity and even from other clerics in their clothing, in their food and their diet, their spaces they use, their conduct, their interaction with members of the other sex, and so on and so on. And these distinctions were not merely idealized in rules, but performed and embodied. They functioned because they were done, they were executed, because otherwise you could say that you're distinct from another person, but another person has to see that you're different. Now, Bourdieu, who published this more than 40 years ago, said that distinction is a natural thing, is something which is imposed or created because of socio-economic differences. You have a ruling class and that imposes a certain way of being different from other people, and that's just that. Sociologists from the last 20 years have criticized that notion and have said distinction is not something which just happens because of socio-economic differences. It's, again, negotiated, quite literally. You have someone who sends out signals of distinction, and you have a public that responds to it, either favorably or not favorably. Your distinction is favorable because people react favorably to it. And so what you see is a lot of competition, also in the early and high Middle Ages, of which form of distinction functions best. And for instance, the discussion between the Cistercians and the Cluniacs over whether being very sober in one's lifestyle or very opulent is the best way is a good example of that. And also the way in which monks were criticized for their behavior, either luxurious or not, is an example of this kind of distinction. Right, I'm maybe going to skip a few things, a few important publications on distinction, which again show that the discussion about distinction takes us beyond the monastic world, and you have in other groups in society. What is somewhat unfortunate is that we don't have many publications that systematically address this problem of distinction within monasticism, and it's kind of important. There's a lot of scholarship on clothing, for instance, and the debate about the kukula, the double kukula of the Cluniacs, and this and that, but we don't have much scholarship that's directly inspired by sociology to work on this. I'm thinking about the work of Jörg Sonntag, but even then, there should be a more systematic. No. Okay. Allow me to move on to a more institutionally focused question, which is that of reform. All the historiography tended to treat monastic reform as a programmatic program that was rolled out to change spirituality, but also institutional organization. For the 10th and 11th centuries, and the identified objectives were creating a unified landscape of following the same rule, to free them from secular interference, and to integrate these communities also finally into larger networks, congregations, and then orders. And then at the head of these movements were the charismatic leaders who thought out the program, rolled it out, and realized it. And so they created the program, and as part of the process of routinization, you would then get an almost self-replicating reform machine that then realized these objectives. Recent studies on early medieval monastic reform have called this interpretation into question. And they see reform as a combination of, indeed, deliberate actions, people who really want to change something about the way monasticism is organized, or spirituality, but also a lot of things could predict, like the interference of outsiders. We have a lot of examples of very well-meaning abbots who want to change spirituality, and then suddenly the bishop comes and says, let's organize the monastic estate at the same time, and then sometimes we have from that. And also things that happen along the way, circumstances that happen along the way. Think about the foundation of the Abbey of Cluny in the early 10th century. Cluny was so successful because its founder, or its principal benefactor, died really early. Cluny, William of Aquitaine, died unexpectedly early, and that created sort of a vacuum for these Cluniacs to just establish themselves as lord, and the Cluniac abbot as lord of the monastic estate. It's not something that was planned. Another important observation is that reform agents of the High Middle Ages, 10th, 11th and 12th centuries, were often people who, if you look carefully, do things that seem very traditional. Pier Damiani, I'm sitting next to the specialist of Pier Damiani, and almost 20 years ago you showed, Nico, that Pier Damiani actually relied on very traditional ways of leading monastic communities, like at Fondavilano. I mean, that's a pioneering institution, but Pier Damiani falls back on things that preceding generations had also been doing. Organizing the estate, establishing relations with donors, that kind of thing. So we need to think about not so much as something, an explosion of novelty always, but as changing things using old methods. Finally, also, and this is something I have worked on quite extensively, is that reform is often an open process. So you know what you start with, but you never know what you end up with, which is something we see today also. And it's something we as historians are often fooled into not seeing because we have the benefit of hindsight how it ended. But people at the time obviously didn't. This may sound really silly, but yeah. We can see a program in a highly successful transformation of an institution, for instance, but people don't have seen where it would have ended. Yeah? And sometimes it ended badly. An inspiration for these ideals is the work of Paul Pearson, which no historian except for myself, as far as I know, has. But it's really important, and it's a short one, so you can rather quickly read it. It's titled Politics in Time, and basically it argues that we need to shift our focus from explaining moments of institutional choice to institutional development. So lots of reforms start with a big bang, and someone who says we need to change things. But from that point onwards, you often have processes that are set in motion, which these original charismatic figures is controlling or didn't even want to control. And so institutions often evolve from an initial point of decision, we want to change something. But what follows is often a succession of events that are either uncontrollable or are dictated by things that are happening along the way. And this is also something we're seeing in monastic settings of the period. And so reform of a monastery should often, preferably, not be studied as a sort of shocking history of that institution, although things that happened might have been shocking at the time. But if you look at it on the longer term, you often see trends and developments that are partly continuation of things that happened before, novelty, and part things that were developments that were unpredictable. I've recently studied quite a few monasteries from north of the Alps to see if there is continuity in the 10th century in staffing, so the monks that are in these monasteries before and after reform. And what we often see is that patronage links, but also recruitment, remains fairly similar across time. So before and after reform, even if narrative texts say that this was not the case. And so there you have continuity, but maybe in governments there is difference. Yeah. Okay, I have as much time as I like, but I'm not going to take all of that. Yeah. A number of publications, of which I apologize, some of which are mine, that talk about monastic as a process, as something which is not something you can bring back to this idea of a big bang and then everything follows from that. I think I was right, and a lot of it. You also published in the, and Nico, you published in the Rethinking Reform volume, which is probably the one that's most warmly recommended, because I just wrote the introduction and all the other chapters are other people, so it's warmly recommended. Also, if you want a PDF, I can send. It's very expensive. It's a very expensive book, but I can send it to you. Now I'd like to say something about social network analysis, which is not strict pure sociology, but it belongs in a discussion of sociology. Traditions of medieval monasticism often told the story of reform, but also the transmission of knowledge and know-how in linear terms, top-down terms, vectorial terms. Cluny influenced institutions. Cluny shaped practices in other institutions. Papal reform changed practices in institutions. But recent studies have pointed out that medieval monasticism was relational. Monastic houses were in dense webs of patronage, kinship, reform movements, textual exchange, and pilgrimage. And so social network analysis provides us with the tool to model these relationships in a non-linear fashion. So when we have a non-linear fashion, the exchanges go in both directions. Even if you're in a hierarchical setting, if knowledge, know-how is exchanged, there's a response. There's always a response. And so the sender of the information will adapt their message to the receiver. The receiver will give feedback. There's always an exchange in two directions. Such an approach shows us how influence, resources, and information flow. That it also allows historians of medieval monasticism to form, but also patronage and cultural exchange as webs of dynamic relationships rather than top-down movements. It highlights the role of institutions and individuals in these institutions as nodes in broader ecclesiastical and social systems, while also raising questions about how to balance qualitative network metrics with qualitative historical context. The reason why I'm showing this book is because it's really useful. It's an introduction to social network analysis applied to medieval history. There's others, and there's actually a couple of chapters that are not that good, and you might well want to read something better, but it's an attempt. But it's an interesting thing, because the image on the cover shows you ways of representing networks, ways of representing exchange, which it should actually be moving. It should actually be showing you the exchange functions, and also how some of the vectors, some of the relations change in size over time, change in intensity. Some are thicker, some relationships should be represented thicker, and some smaller, and so on and so on. I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but if you could be doing this with patronage networks, for instance, or the exchange of knowledge in monastic settings, that would be really exciting. So if you would be able to show dynamically using digital humanities, I would advise any doctoral students these days to get some knowledge of digital humanities, to be honest, but it's not a criticism if you don't, but it's kind of useful, I think. You would be able to show a dynamic evolution over time, interactions and exchanges actually happen. All of this allies with the rejection by sociologists these days of communities and groups in society as completely isolated from the rest of society. Monasticism isolated from the rest of society. Not from other monasteries, but also not from the rest of society. And this is a way of doing it. You can show ties, you can show dependencies, you could show connections, because you can also show information, know-how, and people flowing, going from one place to the next. At the same time, there is a risk involved in applying social network analysis, because it maps the recorded network that we find in the sources, not necessarily in real life. And this is a problem, so I have a doctoral student at the moment who's doing this, who's doing that kind of thing for a couple of monasteries, and then she's showing things that blow people's minds. If she shows it and you're a student, everyone says, wow. But of course, it's only what's in the sources, not what's in reality there. So we need to always say, use a disclaimer and say, this is cool, you can understand better and differently what we're seeing in the sources. We can see patterns emerging from our messy sources, but not necessarily patterns emerging from messy reality. Two different things. Before I reach my conclusions, I want to briefly talk about networks of things. People are bound together in networks of dependency, and they're social. However, it is often objects, texts, objects being exchanged, landscapes also that stabilize relationships across times and crises. Monastic communities use networks of texts and arguments, written arguments, to compensate for the fragility of human networks. So there's many epochs in medieval history where it's difficult to communicate with other communities over long distances, or where there's a fragmentation going on. Well, then texts and objects and connections, physical connections between communities, maintain the memory of those connections, even when it's difficult to maintain them in person. Even though it's difficult to send one person from a monastery to another monastery, you still have a remnant, a memory of those connections, which you can revive once the opportunity presents itself. Social network analysis offers the conceptual tools to reveal that such objects acted as connective tissue, preserving and projecting communal ties. And this echoes studies of weak ties, after Mark Granovetter, sociologist who worked on weak ties, which postulate that non-human entities are vital to create and maintain connections when direct personal links are impossible or unstable over time. Now, exchanging text, and this is something me and my team are currently exploring in two research projects, and you get a small sample of the kind of imaging we're trying to use to reconstruct these network texts that are connected to other texts, that are connected to their place of origin, that are connected to their place of reception, and then very, very briefly, yeah, we have two projects, but I'll skip over that. This is the pipeline for a digital annotation model that we're doing, where we're trying to take historical texts, in this case, saints' lives from the 10th to the 11th centuries, and we're trying to see to what extent they connect communities to each other. They connect it through an explicit historical argument, they connect it through the language that is used in these texts, so we do statistical analysis. They connect it also through the syntax of the text. The transmission of syntax through hagiographical text has an amazing longevity. So because we still need to publish on this, but it's quite amazing to see that texts written in Normandy, for instance, use a very specific syntax that is revealing, even in Latin, of the native language of the writer of the text. So it's a French Latin or something like that. And if the text is transmitted into German-speaking lands, and even in Italian-speaking lands, the syntax, so the visible, recognizable changes that an author makes to the language are erased again, because someone says, this is weird Latin, we'll get rid of this French. But the syntax is maintained and is transmitted sometimes for centuries and then adopted in new texts that are in this place. It's very interesting. Well, I find it very interesting. Anyway. Okay, I want to conclude this presentation on the influence of sociology, which has taken me far from old sociology, obviously, with a few brief observations. First of which is that pure sociological models are rarely applied anymore to study of medieval context, for the simple reason that these are too rigid, too outdated compared to the current state of the art in sociology, and that sociology itself has become more of an eclectic discipline. However, its sensibility continues to influence historical discussions. So the underlying ideas from older discussions still re-emerge, and it's a good thing. Partly under the influence of changes, secondly, within the field of sociology, the function or the focus of sociologically inspired historical research has shifted from monasteries and their members, in the case of monasteries and their members, from static institutions to actors, from rules to practices, and from hierarchies to networks. Networks that go where exchange happens in many directions. Third is that central to this historical research is the notion that early and high medieval monastic groups were actors who shaped their social status, inner and outer relationship, socialized their members, and established their identity through negotiated narratives and practices. There just wasn't a book in the shelf that they took out to do something. There might have been a book, they might have used it, but then they did something with it before it became operational. Conceptually speaking then, the future for medievalists lies in a hybrid approach to the study of group behavior and attitudes, combining sociology, anthropology, cognitive psychology, and other disciplines. And at a methodological level, historians ought to use the vast body of primary sources at their disposal to experiment with new techniques and methods, including maybe a few from the digital humanities, if you can. A lot of software is now available in open source. A lot of this stuff, you can actually go to YouTube, my students tell me, and look at a 10-minute video and you're off, you can do it. I'm sure that if Mark Bloch were alive today, he would say that since history is a science of mankind through time, pioneering these new concepts and methods. Thank you very much.
Noi ringraziamo molto Steven Vanderputten per questo approccio che ha tenuto insieme la storia della storiografia, gli studi sulle nostre ricerche, con un'attenzione alla storia della sociologia e alle applicazioni che ha avuto in ambito storiografico, con prospettive poi di ulteriore sviluppo. molto interessante il fatto che proprio il monachesimo costituisca non un oggetto casuale di osservazione oggi, perché la normatività ha sempre attirato sul monachesimo l'attenzione dei sociologi, no? Questa normatività densa che consentiva l'osservazione di fenomeni interessanti in sede sociologica. Se quello tiene. La critica dell'applicazione la costituzione di un canone di studi di storiografia molto legati alla prospettiva sociologica, persone a noi care che non ci sono più come Giles Constable o come l'amico Brett Melville, che è tuttora molto attivo e con il quale collaboriamo. Questa utilizzazione del carisma che ha costituito, diciamo, il codè storiografico più evidente, no? del dialogo con le scienze sociali. E poi invece le progressive revisioni di paradigmi sociologici, delle interpretazioni troppo lineari, ha portato l'esempio della Rosenwein, che ha messo proprio in evidenza tra gli anni 80 e 90 la propria critica a modelli sociologici rigidi. Quindi il passaggio a nuove prospettive metodologiche che nella ricerca recente hanno integrato la sociologia, l'antropologia, la teoria dell'apprendimento situato. Tutto questo ha portato a una nuova concezione del monachesimo, comunità di pratica. Direi che un'altra parola magica, un'altra parola chiave dell'esposizione sia proprio la valorizzazione della pratica nell'analisi sociologica e storiografica della vita religiosa organizzata, con un dialogo che in tempi recenti si è mantenuto molto, molto vivace e direi molto fruttuoso, anche con Bourdieu e con il concetto di habitus e di distinzione, con appunto una serie di aggiustamenti che hanno consentito di avere una visione molto più dinamica di questi fenomeni. Lo stesso vale per il concetto di riforma, studiata come processo di adattamento, di negoziazione, prospettiva reticolare, no? Ha fatto vedere le potenzialità della social network analysis, ma anche appunto i pericoli. Certo è che abbiamo avuto il quadro di un'evoluzione verso un approccio più fluido, interdisciplinare, in cui i monaci sono attori sociali che producono cultura, identità, relazioni nel tempo. Un'altra cosa determinante mi pare questa attenzione allo shock, non più concepito come un momento, ma come un processo, no? Quindi uno shock che è insieme un processo, come abbiamo potuto constatare in ricerche comuni. Direi che quindi la sua sintesi, perché di sintesi si tratta, ma anche se si potrebbe costruire un bellissimo corso universitario su tutto questo, ci ha offerto molte prospettive per la discussione e sono molto contento di dare la parola dunque a voi perché possiate porre domande in inglese, in francese o in italiano e avrete risposte. Vedremo se in inglese, in francese o in italiano, a scelta. Auch auf Deutsch. Abbiamo anche un amico tedesco il quale può fare domande auf Deutsch. Und auch die Antworten. Auf Deutsch in Mathe.
Perché già è complessa la situazione, io storia delle emozioni, il mio panorama è diventato ancora complesso, nel senso che io finora mi sono basata molto sul linguaggio, invece a quanto ho capito non c'è da fidarsi nemmeno del linguaggio, perché lei, magari mi introduce lei ha detto che le regole anche si evolvono, le personalità si evolvono, perché io penso a un abate come Pier Damiani, che ha evoluto il suo pensiero, ha scritto una regola che non era proprio normativa, ecco, una regola, ma erano più consuetudini però la sua morte non è più stata attualizzata perché era una regola troppo rigida, e quindi penso anche il carisma di Pier Damiani così grande si è andato a affievolire perché poi la regola non è stata più diffusa, quindi anche questo legame tra il carisma di una personalità e una regola che invece poi non viene trasmessa. Se non c'è la regola non va avanti la comunità, oppure basta un carisma per far andare avanti una comunità. Le regole si evolvono e quindi la comunità testuale non può essere chiamata testuale, ma deve essere chiamata appunto della pratica o sociale, perché bisogna basarsi più sulle pratiche che vengono agite più che sulle regole scritte, vista la labilità di tutti questi fattori, i cambiamenti anche della persona umana, che evolve anche nel suo pensiero, i cambiamenti anche delle comunità che magari non accettano più una personalità che le ha fondate, appunto, che è stata significativa per loro. Ecco. Quindi tutti questi fattori mi hanno messo un po' in crisi. Le dico che è stata interessantissima la lezione, ma adesso il mio lavoro lo devo rivedere alla luce di queste nuove considerazioni e la ringrazio.
Oui, je pense. It's a difficult question because you can, if in the case of like the rule of Pier Damiani was, you could arguably it was too rigid to continue beyond the death of Pier Damiani. On the other hand, the fact of not adapting the rule of Pier Damiani beyond his death to new circumstances may indicate that it turns into some kind of memorial document, sort of study document. Much in the tradition which we actually see in the early Middle Ages, where people don't intervene all that much in a number of texts, keep them even if they consider them far too rigid for application. Think also of Benedicto Valiani, who assembles all these rules which he considers far too rigid and difficult to apply, but which remain interesting for study and memorialization, and to give a historical dimension also to practices, current day practices, where you can contrast and compare and adapt and adopt and see where they came from. So this is an interesting thing, and so that at some point rules evolve in practice, but not necessarily in text, because people want to keep the memory of community members want to keep the memory of how one person in time formulated the text. And of course, the immediate trigger for non-adapting it might have been that they said it's too rigid for us. But beyond that, on the longer term, the fact that not adapting might be a way of preserving a certain interpretation of monastic observance in time, because these communities, and that's also something which we need to take into account, exist for such a long time over the generations, that there is an inherent fear of losing memory of an original observance or an original interpretation of the observance. How that relates to your question, because I lost the train of thought at some point. With emotions, I'm not sure.
Capire se il linguaggio può essere ancora un pilastro basilare per studiare la storia o diventa labile, cioè anche questo è un continuo cambiamento.
Labile sì, ancora efficace come
e poi come questo si intreccia appunto con un carisma di personalità forti come Pier Damiani, come l'evoluzione anche del suo pensiero poi influenza, influenzi.
A rule, especially if you can attribute it to a person, remains always an expression of certain ways of seeing things, and emotion does play in that. Whether, and I share the skepticism of you could use these rules to reconstruct or see an emotional community around it. An author or a number of authors who worked on a text and constructed something using specific language, I can see an opportunity to study the emotional language, the emotional dimension in it. Then you always need to be careful, is it an emotion which is semantically embedded in the text, or is it that and an expression of real emotions by real people? The two things, not always 100% convinced that it's the two things together. Pier Damiani might have been a forceful character, but it doesn't mean that every single expression of his in his text, which has a semantically emotional load, says something about his own character. But I may be wrong. We have a specialist here, but I would be skeptical about that. And because you have tradition also, if you read the rule of Saint Benedict, specifically for emotional language, there's lots of emotional language in it. See Benedict as a very clear-headed, rational thinker. I see him as a clear-headed, rational, someone who's focused on organizing a community in a sensible way, a monastic community in a sensible way, under the leadership of an abbot. If you look at the level of individual words, there are lots of emotional terms in it also, but we don't associate him particularly with strong emotions. So I would be careful about that. I wonder if syntactic analysis wouldn't help you, and comparison to other texts from the same period wouldn't help you further in that. But yeah, it's not really an answer to your question.
Other questions? Altre frasi, altre questioni, altre domande. Ho finito le lingue.
Hello, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I would be interested.
Il microfono non funziona.
Proprio vicino. Sì. I would be interested to know more about the role of Malversion.
Yeah.
And to what extent it engages or some current debates about monastic reform, social reform.
Yeah, so my classic question at conferences is, what is monastic reform and what is your definition of monastic reform? I've been doing this for the last 15 years, so I won't. What we definitely see is that in the composition, the last part uses many texts that people who specialize in the Carolingian period will recognize as really important, because it has the Council of extracts from the Council of Worms, the Council of Chalon, which are regarded as something like that. Yeah. I would like to edit it very much, but I'm probably going to try and edit it digitally, so you can actually, instead of a classic edition, you can actually take the texts, every fragment, and link it to the full text, and then see what's taken out of it, and then see the assemblage. That's, yeah, the next year, hopefully. Something new, and something which I haven't done before. Yeah.
Sì, allora, sì, io sono Francesco Borghero, sono un borsista di un istituto, io mi occupo di monachesimo italico nel tardo medioevo, XIV-XV secolo, è una ricerca che è seguita dal professor D'Acunto in questa sede, e insomma questa è davvero una bella occasione in cui insomma, come dire, ore di bibliografia si materializzano in letture, insomma, io ho letto tutti i volumi del professore e la mia più grande domanda è una considerazione. Lei ha chiuso l'intervento appunto rimarcando appunto il momento di, di capitalizzare su questo vasto corpo sul vasto corpo di fonti primarie, no? Tutte queste nuove metodologie, ecco. Qui si rileva, ma è stato rilevato anche in sede convegnistica, in occasione di un seminario prima sulla commenda monastica, ecco,
sì,
come
sì.
c'è una...
I had to be there, but yeah, sorry.
Intervenivo anche appunto per quello, come tutte queste metodologie, queste nuove ricerche, lo abbiamo visto, essenzialmente si riferiscono al monachesimo del pieno medioevo e come, ecco, ancora la storiografia, diciamo la storiografia monastica sul tardo medioevo ancora rimanga, eppure è proprio una, possiamo dire, c'è un controsenso, perché è il momento in cui noi iniziamo delle fonti archivistiche anche seriali, copiose, anche in riferimento agli ordini monastici. Ecco, appunto, la mia non è tanto una domanda, è più non so, una richiesta di un suo parere, di considerazione su questo, anche magari rispetto a quello che avrebbe voluto dire in sede di convegno, insomma. Ero curioso di sapere, ecco, che ne pensa. Sì.
Ce que voulait dire à Marie.
Qu'est-ce que ça signifie le Moyen Âge, le tardif?
I see it as an opportunity. So it's a very difficult exercise, obviously. The later Middle Ages, of course, there's many more documents. So we're talking about vast quantities of documents. What you're seeing is that there's an immense amount of expertise on these documents. There's also an immense amount of documents in general, and so these are two. So it's often very highly specialized expertise. The documents themselves are difficult to manage in general. And so what we're seeing is that in some fields, in early and high Middle Ages, often there's very work going on, very conceptual work going on very few sources. And sometimes one wonders, is that sufficiently based in historical evidence, empirical evidence. And so this is something I mentioned earlier, that sometimes you need to kind of go retour aux sources, they call it, and return to the sources. One of the big challenges, of course, for the late Middle Ages is that there are so many sources, and what we're looking at the moment is, of course, to continue using historical traditions, and no question about that. So the knowledge and the expertise and the savoir-faire and the connoisseurship is really important in that field. But maybe in the coming years, we will be helped by new digital scanning documents and then text recognition. We're not there quite yet. Text recognition is not good enough, but maybe in a couple of years, maybe in 10 years, when we've trained the software sufficiently, we might be able to come to a point where the human hand will still be necessary to read and interpret and see patterns and this and that, but maybe make the work a little bit quicker than it happens at the moment. And of course, then you're looking at a treasure trove of information which we don't have for the early and high Middle Ages. And then you can start seeing big patterns and reconstructing. If you're talking about this kind of thing, for instance, with late medieval sources, then you would have an immense amount of information, of course, to work with. The question now is mostly one of how to access the information, how to manage the information, and so it's an ongoing process. I have to say, I've been tracking the development of annotation, text recognition techniques, and anything to do with scanning documents and annotating documents also on the originals. What has been happening over the last 6 months, for instance, is unbelievable. It's just unbelievable how quickly everything is going. You're seeing new software being developed, and it's not yet being publicized among historians. So it's very much a thing of engineers. Engineers talking to each other how you can scan newspapers and then analyze and whatever. But we can use that quite quickly. It's just a question of reading journals written for engineers. I now read mostly articles written for engineers. It's very difficult. I find it very, very difficult. But I'm seeing free use software. If any doctoral student starts with it, there might well be the new specialist in digital historical research within this and 5 years or 10 years, which is something quite amazing. Things are changing so quickly that we as individuals might not say, I'm going to do it now, but you might want to keep an eye on it, on what is happening. And this is a way to access large bodies of information. I, for instance, work on 10th century hagiographical texts, saints' lives at the moment. And when I started 2 years ago, I said, it's manageable, it's doable, it's only 200 texts, I can read them. And I did. I read all of the editions over the summer. I sat in my garden, I read every single edition, and at the end I was happy I had read everything. And then a linguist told me, you actually need to look at all the manuscripts, because every single manuscript contains syntactic variation and all kinds of other variation. There's 1,800 manuscripts. And I'm not going to be able to read it. It's just impossible. But maybe if we work with scanned versions of the images, we might want to be able to do something meaningful with it. Maybe not within the next couple of years. It's quite amazing. I would encourage, but I've been talking to Nico about giving a lecture in Milan, maybe, about digital annotation of historical text, and we're experimenting with that, and it's unbelievable what you can do. Not me, I'm too old, but my younger collaborators, they can do things that are really, like topic modeling. I don't know if people know topic modeling. So you identify certain topics in a text, or relations in a text, like a narrative text, or like in a charter, you identify people and places. You can now train software to do the same thing again and again on other texts, and you would have to correct everything manually, yeah? But for instance, for charters, we did a test on 1,000 charters from what is now the territory of Belgium, and there's very little error. So the software teaches itself now to be, every time it does the exercise, it becomes better and better. So it's a difficult process, and it's going to be very hard to get all the sources, or as much sources as you want digitized, for instance. But once you get to that point, you're sitting on an enormous amount of information to harvest.
Yes. Abbiamo anche bisogno, il sottotesto è anche che abbiamo bisogno di un'equipe, di un team, sono lavori che richiedono, mi sembra di rilevare anche questo.
The enormous challenge is money, because you need money to develop software and then also, but increasingly that's a possibility, but also you need to increasingly work in teams, and all that's also very difficult to bring together people who work on the same thing, not just in the context of a colloquium, but also in the context of a long-standing collaborations. Of course, this is something which we're seeing now, that history is not a self-contained discipline anymore. You need to work with other disciplines, not the older people, because we can write books until we retire or die or something, but the younger generation really should be doing that. You don't need to give up on your own expertise, and you don't need to give up on to learn 100 new disciplines or fields or something, but to connect people in the right way is the future, I think. Especially to exploit large bodies of evidence and to do something with them and not to stay behind.
Grazie.
Chi non potrà venire a Milano sarà disponibile la diretta del nostro seminario.
Thank you, Professor Vanderputten. This very interesting, inspiring lesson. Now that we opened the Pandora box, I need to ask some questions, practical questions. Thinking about showing the results of a project or some, especially data, I'm currently working with a high number of data, and I was thinking to use NodeGoat to actually give space to also to see the connections between the data that I collected on Excel, but I don't know if you have any other possible better recommendation for this. I don't know, because I was thinking of a tool that actually allows to show project data, but also to see visually like the connections and to, for example, names that appear multiple times on your sheets. So an easier way to...
That is of course a very specific question, which a lot of people are going to find really difficult to understand, but you can, so what you're referring to is essentially a tool to work with either a scanned image or a transcribed text. So you take a text edition, you OCR it, so you turn it into a document you can edit, or you already have one?
No, I'm actually, because I have 15th century notarial act, so
you're doing it
transcribing.
You're transcribing, So you can use NodeGoat then, and NodeGoat has lots of advantages, but it's going to be difficult to translate them into visual networks, for instance. If you want to make a sort of a bubble like this, it's going to be, then my recommendation would be, and this is again very specific, to switch to Label Studio. Label Studio and then work with Gephi. Never in my life had I imagined that I would talk about this and actually be able to give advice on this, but that's the Label Studio and Gephi. NodeGoat has its limits because it's difficult to do a visual network reconstruction too. But I actually have a doctoral student who's doing that, and I can put you in touch with him.
Thank you so much.
Because I look at it and say, great. It's a little too old. Yeah. But these are good tools, even if you're working on late medieval stuff. If you have a good well-defined case, then you can do interesting things. I'm seeing things, people working on charts, but also on narrative documents. Impressive. And these are open source. This is open source software, so people can use it without having to worry about money, essentially. And you can download the software better, because sometimes software is on a server, and then suddenly you have to pay 200 euros to access it. Here you can download it. We're probably going to give a demo of Label Studio or something if we manage something in Milano, and then we can talk about. Well, I'm not going to do it because I'm unable to, but I know how it works.
Thank you.
Io torno invece alla parte più storica, però no, volevo chiederle una cosa, una considerazione. Lei mi è parso che ha un approccio nel vedere le istituzioni monastiche quindi molto come organismo, quindi anche come una sommatoria di individualità che porta come sommatoria anche a rivoluzioni interne, evoluzioni degli ordini, eccetera. Volevo chiederle rispetto, per esempio, lei ha citato spesso Cluny, ma anche altre istituzioni di fama, il ruolo invece che riconosce o non riconosce o rivaluta delle personalità leader degli abbati, quindi come lei intende vedere queste figure all'interno di istituzioni che certamente sono per forza di cose polifoniche, hanno più individualità, però ecco, ci sono dei casi di individualità molto forti. Pensa che questi lavorino nell'ottica dell'organismo?
If I understand correctly, of course you have strong personalities with institutions. What we need to be careful about is not to fall back into the trap of talking about super charismatic people who then change everything for other people. You have monism. Of course we need to take into account roles that are institutionally anchored and add a prior, and the institution itself also exists. Within these institutions you have people interacting. It's more about the interaction, about the individuals changing the lives of many other people in a fundamental way. So for that this image is interesting. So what we're interested in is rather the relation and the interaction rather than the people who are influencing the interaction. Of course you need to look at charismatic individuals historically because there are some charismatic individuals. But if you want to understand how the organism works, you want to see more between the people rather than the dots or the lines between the dots rather than the dots themselves. Now it could be that in 10 years' time someone else is going to sit here and say, no, we need to stop and looking at the lines back to the dots. Yes, of course. And you want to do the two. But we've been used doing, looking at the institution, the bubble, and then at the dots, the connecting nodes, and maybe we now need to look at the lines between the dots to get a fuller picture. We need all these perspectives side by side. So it's not to say the old perspective is bad, now let's do something else. We want to add dimensions to it. That's why this image is interesting because it's supposed to show something three-dimensional. And the three-dimensional dimension is made because of the connections. So if you want to look at the connections, then you're going to step away a little bit from saying, oh, I'm going to study a great charismatic figure and then argue that that person changed it. If there's no audience, no one to interact with, then nothing changes, except for themselves maybe. And that's how I see it, and that's how I do my students. But it's not the only way of interpreting reality, that's all. Is that an answer to your comment? Thank you.
È più una considerazione la mia. Sono rimasto, innanzitutto grazie, ricchissima lezione. Sono rimasto molto colpito, non immaginavo che fosse così avanzata la ricerca nell'ambito appunto degli studi sul monachesimo alto e pieno medievale, che fosse così avanzata l'influenza della sociotecnologia. Conoscevo le tue cose, ma come ce l'hai illustrato anche con queste interessantissime potenzialità in futuro di analisi appunto dei testi, e la considerazione che mi veniva da fare era in relazione al campo di studi che seguo io, che è quello della storia politica, dove sicuramente l'influenza dell'antropologia e della sociologia ovviamente c'è. Però mi appare, e qui volevo sapere anche un po' il tuo parere, a differenza del vostro campo di studi, quello politico mi pare più dispersivo. Procede con pieni e vuoti, e questa transizione, per esempio, che tu nella pagina conclusiva dell'ultima slide hai messo il passaggio dalle istituzioni agli attori, dalle norme alle pratiche, dalle gerarchie ai networks, si sta facendo, grosso modo ispira anche gli studi, ma secondo me è meno coerente al momento rispetto al quadro. Di fatto, naturalmente, il quadro ha una sua narrazione che tende a rendere tutto coerente e logico. Però mi chiedo, e stavo cercando di capire quali potessero essere gli elementi di differenziazione. Uno è il campo stesso, il monachesimo forse è più definibile come spazio di strutturazione di pratiche, di comunità, eccetera. L'altra è rispetto, non so, penso impero, papato, autonomie cittadine, monarchie, sono istituzioni più ampie sicuramente, però l'approccio lo si fa, ma non con questa sistematicità. Ecco, ancora una discontinuità, mentre qui evidentemente è un campo d'azione che ormai, grazie a te e grazie anche ad altri studiosi, come Nico, eccetera, si sta cominciando a fare nell'ambito monastico. E quindi mi chiedo, uno, tentativo di risposta, insomma, e qui volevo sapere se concordavi, se avevi altre suggestioni. Uno appunto è l'ambito in sé, le comunità monastiche sono, diciamo così, forse, ma la mia ignoranza, la mia ingenuità, più definibili. Due, l'altezza cronologica, quando ti riferivi a poi, insomma, rispetto alla complessità e alla dispersività delle esperienze monastiche, forse le cose sono un pochino più complesse. E poi soprattutto la documentazione. Qui anche queste possibilità, che è bellissima per l'analisi che hai fatto della stratigrafia, le mani sul codice, una cosa interessantissima. Ecco, questo già la vedo molto più complessa per il campo, non so, relazioni tra poteri locali e poteri centrali, monarchico, diciamo così. Non so, è una considerazione di carattere generale, però mi veniva da fare perché sono molto ammirato, molto colpito, insomma, da questo grado di finezza d'analisi che ci hai mostrato.
Also a question of, you make some very, very pertinent remarks. It's also a question of historiography. So the historiography of monasticism is shaped by the fundamental idea that monasticism is a spiritual phenomenon that is fundamentally institutional. So yeah, so it's the ideal. So at the beginning, people were drawn to test sociological models on monasticism because it looks ideal, but it's ingrained in the study of monasticism to look at the phenomenon from an institutional point of view, which I also disagree with. That's not monasticism as such, it's an expression of a certain form of monasticism. But it's, and also if you want to think again about how monastic life works, the first thing you need to do is think about to what extent you find the institution important, and to which extent the institution develops agency. And in the case of monarchy, for instance, it's already, it's not the same thing as with cities also, right? It's an institution, no? And people will be more easily convinced to say, well, we're not going to approach it as an institution, we're going to approach it as a social organism or something like that. Monastery is much more difficult. Monasticism, since the birth of the study of monasticism from a scholarly point of view, which is essentially the 17th century or something, something. And the same with rules, the same with written text. So if I talk about thinking again about the role of written text and everything like that, that too goes back to St. Jerome, who said monasticism originated with the creation of new rules. with monastic rules. And so Benedict of Ariane repeated this, and in the later Middle Ages, the Council of Basel repeated this, and Jean Mabillon repeated it, and so on and so on. Everyone keeps insisting that monastic life is shaped through rules, which is problematic. So it's easy, I admit that, it's easy to say, so let's go look at sociology through the lens of monastic institutions. That's true. It also explains why the discussion, I may have overstated this, is more focused than in other fields. In other fields it's more dispersed, but there's no single point of attack. So we can attack we can attack the rule, the text, and that's not as present. So I suspect that if people would be systematically looking at urban institutions in the late Middle Ages from a social lens, which they are actually doing at the moment, but in a maybe less organized way, and it's people are using it a bit, in their own, at their own intuition, so to speak. If I'm not judging too much, but I see that happening. Yeah? Then if they would do it a little bit more systematically, they would probably end up with similar questions, definitely. And once you see institutions emerging, once you see, there are institutions, but how do they develop agency, and what kind of agency do they develop, as opposed to the people inside them? That kind of questions. It's like, if you talk to people working on urban history, and I'm most familiar with people working on history in the Low Countries and Germany, they talk about the city does this, the city does that, the city does nothing. It's the people in the city who do things, not necessarily as individuals, but collectivities and actors. Similar question. Yeah. Yeah.
Grazie.
Yes.
Bene, in questa della differenza, delle differenti intensità, la mutevole intensità dei rapporti tra storia e scienze sociali, credo che sia giusto chiudere qui. Ringrazio il professor Vanderputten, di ringraziare ancora la professoressa Jean per il bel seminario di questa mattina. Credo che non siano mancati, anzi siano stati abbondanti i materiali per la nostra riflessione, per il rinnovamento della griglia problematica delle nostre ricerche, indipendentemente dall'argomento, e credo che sia stato veramente un immergerci in un modo di fare storia che in Italia fa un po' a emergere, sebbene si siano aperti nel corso degli ultimi decenni spiragli significativi. Farete ritorno alle vostre case e ciascuno di voi mediterà su quello che ha ascoltato oggi e si farà provocare, magari leggendo tutti i volumi che ha elencato il professor Vanderputten e la professoressa Jean questa mattina. Siamo qui per questo, con il direttore, il consiglio direttivo è unanime proprio nel riconoscere questa linea di azione, di aggiornamento metodologico dei dottorandi e non solo, una delle linee d'azione prioritarie dell'istituto. Crediamo che sia un'ottima iniziativa e giornate come queste lo confermano. Allora, grazie a voi che siete venuti, grazie a chi ancora una volta ha animato questa bellissima giornata. Buon lavoro allora, che avete tanto da studiare, anch'io sono contento di questo. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.